It's good to be back with you guys, and I'm so grateful to Pastor John from Central Press for preaching last week. This morning, we're continuing on in our journey through the Gospel of Mark. I want to ask, are any of you photographers this morning, or photography enthusiasts? Okay, good. 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. So this illustration will work for you. Everybody else, you're on your own. You know, kind of at this time of year, it's fall, it's pumpkin patch season, so you just got to take your kids out and do the obligatory sort of pumpkin shots. And you'll know if you want to get a picture of your kid with the background, sort of the orange pumpkins and the corn stalks a little bit blurred out so the kid pops. The way you do that is you separate your kid from the background, you bring your kid forward, and then you open the aperture, that's like the pupil on your camera, pretty wide, and then you focus right on that kid until they're tack sharp. And then the background should be blurred out a little bit. And what you'll discover is, this is the principle of the focal plane. What you'll discover is once you have opened the aperture really wide, the depth of field, that's the number of things that are in focus, shrinks. So once you've focused on your kid, everything that's in that same focal plane, everything that's the same distance from your camera as the thing you are focusing on is also in focus. That's the principle of the focal plane. So if you are trying to take a picture of two kids, you focus on one of them and you just hope that your other kid is in the same focal plane. Otherwise, that's going to come back to bite you when they're teenagers and they're like, "Daddy, you never saw me." But that's the principle of the focal plane. I say that because this morning we are going to read a story that for many of us is very familiar, whether or not you have grown up in the church. It's sort of the story of the baby Jesus and the wise men and the kings. And we're going to go through that story. And I think for many of us, familiarity kind of gives us inattentional blindness, right? If you read something or come to a situation that you're really familiar with, it's hard to see new things. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to focus on some things that we don't normally focus on. We're going to focus on King Herod, and we're going to focus on the wise men, however many there were. I'm going to focus on the wise men because, here's why, they are, chronologically speaking, the same distance from us as Jesus. And if we are careful to bring them into sharp focus, Jesus is in the same focal plane. We should see Jesus more clearly in fresh ways that perhaps we didn't see before. So that's what we're up to this morning. I want to read the text for you, and then I'll pray, and then we'll get down to work. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. I'll read it. You can follow along on the screen or in your copy of the Word of God or on your phone or your neighbor's phone if you like. Here we go. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. At that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we've come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote." And he quotes here Micah 5:2 and 2 Samuel 5:2. "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." Are we believing him? After this, the interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And when it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. Father, I believe that you exist. I believe that your Spirit inspired these words to be written through human authors. years and years ago. And I believe since you are still alive today that it makes sense to ask you to help us to understand this. So please send your Spirit here to help us imaginatively get into this text, to bring it into focus so that we see Jesus afresh, so that your Spirit can apply this word in our lives in a way that changes the way we see the world, that motivates us, and not only motivates us, but empowers us to live differently as a result. We want to be changed this morning as a result of meeting with you. Come, Spirit of the risen Jesus. Amen. The story starts with Herod, who doesn't actually feature too much in our New Testaments, but if you were ever to go to Israel, one of the first things you would notice is that this guy Herod was boss. Like even today, 2,000 years after he lived, you go to Israel and the surrounding countries and you see city after monument, after building, after artifact that just blows your mind, and they were all built by this guy, Herod the Great. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Herod was born in 73 BC in a place called Idumea. Idumea is modern-day southern Jordan, okay? And if you're trying to picture that, this is what southern Jordan looks like. Remember, anybody seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Remember, he goes into the temple there in Petra, that red rock treasury in Petra. That's in the land of the Idumeans. Biblically, the Idumeans are the descendants of the Edomites. So you don't need to know this, but the Edomites were the offspring of a guy named Esau. You might remember a Jacob and Esau story in the Old Testament. So Herod is born an Idumean in modern-day southern Jordan. About a century before that, Idumea had been captured overrun by the Judeans. And so he is born into an overpowered people group. His father, a guy named Antipater, was politically savvy, and he cozied up to the Judean king, and he became governor. And a few years later, 63 BC, when Rome comes in and takes over Judah, the whole area of Judea, Herod starts to follow in his father's footsteps, and he's pretty politically astute. So his dad sets him up as the sort of the procurator over, or the proconsul over a place called Galilee up in the north, and he just lays down the law with an iron fist. And he's so violent and so ruthless that the establishment in Jerusalem start to get a little bit worried about him, and they complain about him. And so he flees. But he's politically savvy, so what he does is he flees to Rome with a stack of cash in his hand. He puts himself into exile, goes to Rome, cozies up to Julius Caesar, and it gets sent back. This time, he's governor over one of the most important regions in a land called Syria. Okay. Then Julius Caesar dies, or he's murdered. You might remember that from your Shakespeare and your classical history. Herod now cozies up to Mark Antony. Okay. He cozies up to Mark Antony, and then the Roman Senate makes him. They makes him a king over all of Judea now. So he, who is part of an occupied people group, becomes king over the people who had occupied his own nation, and is put in position by the third people group, who are the most powerful people in the world at the time, who have overpowered that second people group. Does this make sense? Let me give you another picture. It's like this guy has an uncanny ability to swim to the surface. No matter how much water his peers are under, this guy always floats to the top. Just uncanny skill. And he was a master builder. So anyway, he's king over Judea, and he realizes he's now in this sort of precarious position, because he's cozy with Rome. He's cozy with the emperor of Rome, like Mark Antony and now Octavian, the emperor of Rome, are his Facebook friends. Cleopatra, you've heard of her, Facebook friends. Like, these are the circles he runs in. But he needs to kind of insert himself with the Jewish aristocracy, because remember, he's not really Jewish. He's from Jordan. So he marries a princess named Mariamne, who's part of the family of the Maccabees. You might have heard of them. They are the family around which we have the celebration Hanukkah. Okay? So she's a Jewish princess. And now he is in tight with at least the Jewish aristocracy in Jerusalem. He's got the power and the might of Rome behind him. Now all he needs is cash. He's a smart guy. He knows from growing up in the Petra area that this is the gateway to all of the spices of Arabia. So he knows these camel trains of spices are coming out of Arabia. They're headed to Rome, they're headed to Europe, and they're either going to hit the coast and go south to the ports of Egypt, or they're going to hit the coast and go north to the ports of Turkey. And he's like, hold on, we need our own port here, so that they stop and some of the goods filter into this land. This guy knows how to work a deal. So he builds a port. Not just any port, but like the port to end all ports. We got the first picture here. And because this guy knows how to climb, he names this first port after Caesar. So he builds this incredible port up on the coast of modern-day Israel, and it's called Caesarea Maritima. That big expanse of ocean that you see behind the people there was not a natural port. He built that by having concrete sunk 30 meters down into the sea and cured there in ways that engineers still find baffling today. He did this 2,000 years ago. He built an incredible palace there so that when the ships of the ancient world came to Israel, they were not only depositing their money there, but they were starting to see who this king was. He built a hippodrome, which you can barely see in the background there, which was basically a race course for chariots and hippos. And then that was a joke. Thank you, you got it. And then an incredible palace. And this palace had this ridiculous Mediterranean Ocean view, and then my personal favorite part, an Olympic-sized freshwater swimming pool that you see here in the foreground stretching out into the middle of the Mediterranean. So you get all of the luxury of being in the Mediterranean with the added benefit of being in freshwater. Unfortunately, there wasn't any fresh water nearby, so he had to build an aqueduct to bring fresh water in from Mount Carmel, 20 miles away. So this guy knows how to build a seaside palace, but he also knows how to build a desert palace. You can take us to the next picture, Jeff. This is a palace that he built, a very famous, perhaps the most famous fortress in Israel today. It's called Masada. He built this on top of this kind of mesa mountain along the edge of the Rift Valley. That's the Dead Sea you see up there in the top left of the screen. And you can just imagine, without knowing the first thing about engineering, you look at this and you're like, how on earth do you get building materials and equipment up onto the top of this? I don't know, but he did. And he built this incredible fortress there that had a palace. It had cisterns in it and storehouses full of ancient Viagra and cisterns that would hold food and fresh water to feed 10,000 troops for a decade. Like, this guy was ridiculous stockpiling. And then on the front edge, the narrow edge of that mesa, you see their palace with staterooms, bedrooms, looking out over the gorgeous azure waters of the Dead Sea, which are like slashed into the Rift Valley there. And then, yes, another hanging swimming pool dangling over this incredible desert. We have no record that Herod ever visited this place. This is the sort of weekend home that you build just in case. However, my personal favorite is this one. If you go to Jerusalem and you stand up on the Mount of Olives just outside the temple, which he also built, and you look south towards Bethlehem, this is what you see on the horizon. Can you give us the next picture, Jeff? A volcano. Except there aren't any volcanoes in the area. This is a mountain that Herod built. That thing was half its current height, and there used to be another mountain nearby. He leveled the other mountain and moved it, stacked it on top of the existing mountain in order to make this enormous conical volcano for a palace named after himself, Herodium. And you drive in and you see there in front of you, there is another swimming pool. This was the largest freshwater swimming pool in the Middle East at the time. So big that it had, you see that stone sort of circular structure there. It had an island in the middle of it, so you could row your boat halfway out into the swimming pool to have a private conversation on the island. There's a half-mile-long parade ground leading up to this volcano. You get there, and then there are 400 marble stairs leading up. Midway up the mountain, it goes into a tunnel that goes into the mountain. You emerge in the center, what is like the cone, the crater in the middle of this volcano, and rising up out of it is this double-walled palace with ramparts that just erupt into the sky. I mean, this was an amazing, amazing man. Incredible wealth, incredible power, vision, and influence. 3 miles from here, it's a little town called Bethlehem. And every year, after the harvest, or around the time of harvest, just following it, the shepherds who graze their sheep most of the year in the desert, where there's not much grass, are allowed to bring their sheep in to graze in the farmers' fields after they've cut down the wheat in order to get the last gleanings. Herodium and Bethlehem are in that sort of farm territory on the verge of the desert and the wilderness. And so the farmers would come there, and the sheep would graze in what's left of the fields. And at night, in order to protect the sheep, they would retreat into these little kind of rocky caves, overhangs that are all over the area. And they would stack rocks along the entrance to the cave to provide a little bit of a wall. And I've been in some of these, and you'll see these low-hanging rocky ceilings with soot from thousands of years of campfires in them. And the floor underneath is spongy and reeks of feet of sheep and goat manure. And probably in one of those, or maybe in the similar little hovel underneath a farmer's house, literally in the shadow of that volcano, a teenage girl gave birth to a little baby boy. And the guy who built that mountain palace and named it after himself was terrified. What's going on? In verse 3, it says, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone else in Jerusalem. Presumably, Matthew is talking here about the rest of the religious establishment in Jerusalem. That's the way he tends to use that language. In verse 4, he then called a meeting to find out where this Messiah was supposed to be born. And then in verse 7, he calls in the wise men for a private meeting with them to find out when the star has appeared. Who are these wise men? These wise men, I think the older translations call them the we three kings, right? You might have heard the language of kings. They probably weren't so much kings. Another word for them is magi, which is English for the Greek word magi. They're basically like, if you want to imagine, sort of a Middle Eastern Dumbledore, like Dumbledore with a turban and maybe a hookah. I mean, that's getting you, that's not all the way there, but that's the right direction. Like, these guys were essentially Middle Eastern wizards. They were probably from, we don't know exactly where these guys were from, but probably from modern-day Iraq or Iran. And their job was star study. Their job was magic. Their job was presiding over pagan religious ceremonies. They were deeply influential in the courts of the day. They would often steer policy because they were able to predict the future, or so it was assumed. They were the ones who guided the kings in what to do. Okay, that's who these guys were. Some of you probably remember in the Old Testament book of Daniel, during the exile, some of God's people are captured and they're carried off to precisely those lands. And a young Jewish boy named Daniel is given supernatural power by God to interpret dreams. And so Daniel quickly rises through the ranks of these sorts of people. The magic workers, the soothsayers, the magicians, the Middle Eastern wizards. He rises up through their ranks because God has given him the ability to interpret dreams and to know stuff, a wise man. These were precisely the sort of people and practices that God's people were not meant to dabble with, right? They didn't follow the Jewish religion. They were other religions. They did magic. They weren't from there. And yet, these wise men Presumably, somehow in God's mercy, had learned enough of the Bible, maybe through people like Daniel sharing it with them generations before. They had learned enough that when God made this star rise in the sky, they were willing to step out of their very important jobs and jump onto camels and journey for who knows how long to arrive in a city called Jerusalem. Presumably because they thought that's where a king would be born, because they knew the current king of the Jews, a guy named Herod, lived there. And then the star moved them on to a little town called Bethlehem and stopped over a house. And they went into this house, and these influential wizards bowed down before a Jewish toddler who probably could barely speak his own language, let alone theirs. And he's maybe pulling at their funny hats and distracted by the shiny jewelry they're wearing. And they don't care. They just get on their faces before him and open their treasure chests and give him the very best they've got. Because they know this toddler is the true king. It's amazing the way Matthew sets up this tableau, right? It's this clash of kingdoms, this confrontation of different concerns. They're just, it's breathtaking. And I just want to draw out one takeaway for us that I think will impact different ones of us in different ways, and that's this. Just because you seem like you are near to God, or just because you seem or look like you are far from God, does not mean that you are. I'll say that again. Just because it looks like you're near to God, or just because it looks like you're far from God, does not mean that in fact you are. I think if you had asked the Magi, is King Herod close to God? They would have said, of course. This is the guy who sits on David's throne. His title on their currency is King of the Jews. I mean, look how successful he is. Of course, God's hand of blessing is upon this guy. Of course, he's near God. And by the way, have you seen the temple that he built for God? I mean, people come here from Rome and they're blown away by the size and grandeur of this temple. Of course, this guy is near to God. And Herod receives word that the Messiah, the anointed, appointed leader of God, has been born. He is deeply disturbed and does everything in his power to eradicate him from the face of the earth. And my guess is, similarly, if you had asked Herod or Herod's courtiers, are these magi close to God? They would have said, what? Are you kidding me? Close to the God of the Jews? They're the wrong race. They're foreigners. They're not from here. They don't belong here. Look at the religion they practice. Look at their behavior. Of course they're not aligned with the God of the Bible. They do weird stuff. Their lifestyle isn't up to snuff. Of course they're far from God. And yet those people, by God's grace, through God leading them by what they knew, as little as it was, journeyed across deserts to arrive before a Jewish toddler and pay him homage. Say, we're in your hands, and give them the best they had. This contrast is just brimming with warning and with hope. I want to say, maybe some of us need to hear the warning. Like maybe it looks on the outside like you're close to God. I'm sure it looked that way with respect to Herod. But Herod, the more we find out about him, the more it looks like he was a deeply, deeply troubled man. And I think a lot of that trouble was because he was a man bent on keeping up appearances. There were rumors certainly circulating among various elements of the Jewish people that he didn't belong. He wasn't truly a Jewish person. He was an Idumean. And it seems like this led him into a lifestyle of trying to desperately cling to keeping up appearances. So much so that he grew deeply, deeply paranoid near the end of his life, killed 2 of his sons, had his beloved wife, Mariamne, killed off. So much so that Octavian the emperor said, better to be Herod's hus, his pig, than his huios, his son. And I think this man was just trying to keep up the appearances that he was who everybody believed he was. That he was the king put in this position by God, that he was close to God. And I just want to say that for some of us, maybe you find that you're in that same position where you feel like you are just clawing with everything you've got to keep up the public face. To make it look like you've got it together, to make it look like your relationship with God is intact. And yet, when you have opportunities to encounter the real God and the gifts he has sent, the people he has put in your life, it's terrifying for you. And frankly, you just rather not. That's the warning. Herod is set up as sort of the archetype of God's people who look like they're God's people on the outside, but in the center, they're all about themselves. If you line up all the artifacts of Herod's life, Herodium, Masada, Caesarea Maritima, even the temple in Jerusalem, it's clear he was a worshiping man. But you line up all of these artifacts, and the trajectory of his worship circles right around to himself. And then some of you might feel like you don't think you're possibly good enough for God. Or like, how could you ever be near to God? You feel like your life just looks the opposite on the outside. And maybe you feel totally uncomfortable even being in church and having somebody read the Bible or singing these songs we're singing this morning. Maybe you feel like you're just a spiritual pilgrim and you're on this quest and you are looking for God. And the challenge to you, the hope to you this morning would be, you don't have to look right on the outside in order to discover the King. You don't need to have your life together on the outside in order to be accepted by the King. And as a Christian, as somebody who has tried to build a relationship with God, who has enjoyed a relationship with God for years, I believe that this Jesus is the one you're looking for, if that's you. This Jesus, the triune God of the Bible, most clearly presented to us in Jesus, is the King of the universe. If you're here this morning and you're hearing this, then you have found him. And just like those wise men, the response is just to get on your face before him and worship him. He's the true King. And then the challenge for some of us who maybe have been following Jesus for years or have been Christians for years, have trusted him for years, is look at the seeking that the wise men did. Look at the seeking the wise men did. Who knows how many nights they spent in the desert? Who knows how many months they were journeying to come to worship this King? But I think that maybe some of us have accepted intellectually that Jesus is the King. Maybe you've had a relationship with him, but it's just sort of stagnated. And if you're honest with yourself, once you found him, you stopped seeking him. Dallas Willard famously has said that grace is opposed to earning. It's not opposed to effort. Grace is opposed to earning. It's not opposed to effort. Relationships take effort. So I just say to you this morning, if you're in that category and you have a relationship with Jesus, but you feel like you've stopped pursuing him as God's true king for the world, then remember who he is. You can't earn a relationship with him. You can't buy a relationship with him. You don't have to have your life cleaned up to be accepted by him. But are you pursuing him? Are you seeking him? He's worth being sought. In a moment here, we're going to celebrate the Lord's table. And there's a challenge in this passage. These wise men came bringing the very best they had to present as gifts to the Lord in worship. We're going to have worship through offering here. If you guys want to make offerings, you can put them in the boxes here. But essentially, the posture of worship is this. It's not earning, it's not buying, it's coming empty-handed and saying, in this relationship, Jesus, we bring nothing to the table. So in a minute, you guys are going to be invited up to share in communion, and we come like this. We come like, I've got nothing. I'm arriving here before the King of the universe who has given himself for me, for you, for all of us. And that's what this meal commemorates, his body and his blood poured out for us on the cross when he irrevocably gave himself for us. So that no matter whether you look far away or you look nearby, if you come to him, worship him as the true king, you are received.